Welcome to the Armchair Wine Traveller, a series of reflections and interviews about the world of wine and travel. I am Jeremy Shaw of Iberian Wine Tours, and I'm delighted to present the first episode about the Judgement of Paris wine tasting that happened in 1976 and revolutionised wine. I was lucky enough to work in the late 1980s at the Academie du Vin and the Cave de la Madeleine in Paris, and so it's a special pleasure for me to present the first part of the episode, which is an interview I conducted with Steven Spurrier in Barcelona recently at our 10th anniversary celebration, followed by my reflections on what the tasting meant for the world of wine and the future of wine tasting. We're delighted to have you here in Barcelona to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Iberian Wine Tours.
Thank you very much.
A particularly good reason that we're pleased that you're here is I once upon a time worked in the Academie du Vin, which inspired me in the world of wine. I think you've said sometimes it's one of the things, if not the thing you're most proud of in the world of wine. Why are you so proud of the Academie du Vin?
Well, the assumption is the thing I'm most proud of is the Judgement of Paris, but that was set up by l'Académie du Vin. So had there been no Académie du Vin, there would have been no Judgement of Paris. And the Académie du Vin was set up to reply to a demand from my actually American clients in the very early days of Cave de la Madeleine, who they used to come by the shop, my little tiny shop, and I used to give them a taste of the new wines that I bought that had come in, and run them through them a bit. And they said, if you could put this in a more structured manner, we'd love to learn more about wine. We'd love to take a wine course. And I'd become friends with John Winroth, who was the wine correspondent for the Herald Tribune at the time, Swedish-American. And he was teaching wine courses in the back of cafes to junior year abroad students. And so we just combined, and the place next door came up to rent. It was a locksmith shop, and quite what you need a locksmith in the middle of the Madeleine for, I don't know. Obviously you did at some point. And so we took it over on 2 floors and created l'Académie du Vin, but I didn't intend it to be called l'Académie du Vin. My application was for l'Ambassade du Vin, the wine embassy, because I never thought of myself as an educator. I thought of myself as an ambassador for wine, and still do, a communicator. But that was taken by somebody, and so we then applied for l'Académie du Vin, and an academy in France is something that you aspire to belong to at a great age, and not a school. And since no one had dared register l'Académie for anything, certainly not l'Académie du Vin, I got through. So that's it.
It was a magical place. I remember the Cité Barrier. There was a delightful ambience about the whole place, and particularly about the Académie du Vin and the Cave de la Madeleine beside it. What are your happiest memories of the place and the time?
Well, I mean, I think finding the shop with a friend of mine, we were walking up to have lunch in the Moulin du Village, the restaurant which I subsequently bought, which was basically the beginning of the end of my empire. I should not have gone into the restaurant business. And we passed this shop, and I said to him, Christopher, I said, that's my dream, a little shop like that. I know exactly what I could do with it. He dragged me in, and I looked around the shelves, and the lady owner behind the counter said, may I sell you something? Or would you like to buy anything? And my friend said, my friend would like to buy your shop. And it happened to be for sale. It had been for sale for 2 years. So we did a deal, but then she got second thoughts because her husband had been a very good caviste and he died of cancer. And she couldn't see how a young Englishman who didn't speak very good French could quite carry on the reputation of her late husband. So I did a deal with her. I said, look, Madame Fougère, here's the deal. We're in October. I'll work for you for 6 months for nothing. And if after those 6 months you think I can honor the memory of your late husband, I'll take over the shop. Well, of course, during those 6 months, I learned exactly what I wanted to do with the shop. I got to know the clientele, I got to speak better French, and so on and so forth. And on April the 1st, April Fool's Day, she gave me the keys to the shop, And I put an ad in the Herald Tribune which read, "Your wine merchant speaks English, call Steven Spurrier."
And the rest, as they say,
And the
was
rest
history.
is history. Yeah.
So you mentioned that at the beginning, the Judgement of Paris, which of course is perhaps the thing you're best known for. How do you look back now on the Judgement of Paris in terms of what impact you think it had? What difference do you think it made, looking back?
Well, I mean, it made a tremendous difference to California. That was very plain. It also, in hindsight, or it also, within a year, made a great difference to France. And as Aubert de Villaine, who was one of the judges, Aubert de Villaine of Lambry-Conti, said in much more vulgar French than the English translation, it was a much-needed kick in the pants for French wine. It was the first chink in the armor of French wine. And France needed waking up, and this woke them up. And it is no coincidence that the first vintage of Opus 1, the joint venture between Robert Mondavi and Philippe de Rothschild, was 1979. And I'm certain that Philippe de Rothschild would not have gone into business in a joint venture with Robert Mondavi had it not been for the Judgement of Paris.
And looking back, the Judgement of Paris had an enormous impact. I think perhaps by implication, underlying that was the Academie du Vin that enabled it to happen.
Well, I mean, we were terribly respected. We hadn't asked for a cent from anybody, and normally, I wouldn't say organizations have their hands out the whole time, but we were known that we were completely self-financed. We were the only game in town in terms of education in Paris, and so when we began to put together the list of 9 judges, the top palates in France, we got them. And so that was Paris, Academie du Vin, top wine palates. It was the Judgement of Paris was an event whose time had come. But they were only going to just taste French wine, California wines. That's what they had been invited for. And about even 10 days before the date, I told Patricia Gallagher, my partner in Academie du Vin, whose idea it basically was, who created the 76, it'll be the bicentennial of the American Revolution. And I said, Patricia, I'm very worried they're going to judge these wines and they'll damn them with faint praise. And it's not what we want. What we want is recognition of quality coming out of California. She said, okay, what are you going to do about it? I said, I'm going to turn it into a blind tasting with the best wines from my shop. From White Burgundy is the best wine from my shop in Claret. And she said, that's not what they're coming for. I said, well, I'll ask them. So when they turned up, I said, you've come to taste California wine. And I personally thought it would be more interesting if we could taste them blind against the comparative vintages from Burgundy and Bordeaux, but I can only do that if you agree. And of course they said, pas de problème. But I mean, if they said, no, we don't want to do it, then it wouldn't have happened. But the real importance of the Judgement of Paris, or the real importance of that tasting, was that it created a template whereby unknown wines of quality could be tasted blind against known wines of quality. And if the judges were themselves of quality, their judgment would be respected. And that completely leveled the playing field. And so I don't know whether you've heard of the Berlin tasting, Eduardo Chadwick, and it goes on the whole time. But no one had quite packaged it like that.
So you opened the door to this new approach that opened the door for wines that were perhaps lesser known or respected.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the, well, now the world of wine is so open with blogs and the internet and everything like that. But communications were much slower in those days, and blind tastings didn't happen. I mean, the wines were tasted blind, but the idea of a comparative blind tasting from comparing iconic wines from one country against the same great varieties, but unknown from another country. Hadn't ever happened before.
Did it close some doors for you in France?
I was physically thrown out of Ravenet Prud'hon cellars in Burgundy when I went to take up my allocation a few months later, but apart from that, not much, no.
So fair to say in the long run it was worth it?
Well, it was my 15 minutes of fame, put it that way. I mean, it's simply not going to go away. George Tabor's book said, "The Judgement of Paris, the tasting which revolutionized wine." And I think that's pretty much the truth.
A great legacy to have. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
So first of all, I'd like to reflect on the context for the tasting. The tasting couldn't have happened without a series of events and activities that Stephen and others had carried out leading up to 1976, and some coincidences and some things that happened that enabled it to shine like it did. First of all, Stephen set up the Academie du Vin and the Cave de la Madeleine in the Cité Berrier in, I think, 1972. The Cité Berrier was a old-fashioned French alley in the midst of glitz and glamour, in the very richest part of Paris, very close to the Madeleine, close to the Place de la Concorde. But it was reflection of old French society with butchers and bakers and almost candlestick makers there. It created an atmosphere and environment that allowed great wine to be sold, but in a humble environment, if you like, amidst a lot of glitz and gold. So that was there. If the Académie du Vin hadn't been there, the tasting could never have happened. The Académie du Vin itself, the place, it was the educational element of the story. It was where people went to learn about wine tasting, and about the world of wine. The Cave de la Madeleine next to it was where the great wines were sold. And clearly, predominantly, they were French wines. And the fact that they were there allowed Stephen, the week before the Judgement of Paris actually took place, to decide that it wouldn't just be Californian wine, he could add some great French wines as well, because he had them in his shop. By creating a place that people, particularly foreigners in Paris, could come to learn about wine, he was able to attract people that otherwise wouldn't have come to his door. So like George Tabor, the guy that wrote the book about the tasting, and most importantly of all, made the article in Time magazine in June 1976, he came and did a tasting and an event at the Académie du Vin. So they had him on the books, they had his number, so when they were looking for somebody to come along to cover the event, they were able to call George, and he was able to show up. Otherwise, there would have been no press coverage. Another thing I'd like to just consider is Stephen's attitude. Patricia Gallagher, who worked with him and who was fundamental to setting up the tasting, always said of Stephen, when you were looking for a new idea and suggested it to him, he would often reply by saying, "Wouldn't it be fun to give it a try? Wouldn't it be fun to try something out?" So that attitude of wouldn't it be fun to create, wouldn't it be fun to experiment, created an environment where this could happen. If you didn't have the mindset and the attitude that something original could happen, you never would have got to the starting line in the first place. Doggedness as well, in the face of challenging conditions to set up something like this. So Patricia had tried to set up, and she was working with Stephen, a Californian wine tasting in 1974, 1975. It didn't work out. She went out to California in 1975, and in the summer, through some introductions, she went out to Napa Valley and met many of the winemakers and the wineries that were represented in the tasting in June 1976. If she hadn't done that, it wouldn't have happened. If she hadn't come back and recommended those wines to Stephen, it wouldn't have happened. But even then, when they got to Christmas and into the new year and thought, oh, it would be nice to have a wine tasting to celebrate the bicentennial and the bicentenary for the American wines to be recognised in France, Stephen still had to go out to California, and he did, with Bella, his wife, in March 1976. And he showed a lot of doggedness, because he went to the places that he wanted to show their wines, but not all of them were prepared to open their doors to him. In particular, Heights and Ridge told him not to bother. But luckily, he didn't take no for an answer. He went up to Heights, managed to taste 2 wines, was complimentary about them, was able to include them in the tasting, and he did the same at Ridge. Without that doggedness, it probably would never have happened. Above all, the Cave had great Bordeaux and Burgundy wines, and the Académie du Vin had a culture of appreciation and education about wines that allowed something like the Judgement of Paris to flourish. Context is everything. So the event itself. We talked about the context. I'd like to talk a bit about how the event came about and some of the key features that were perhaps a little lesser known and surprising about how it happened. Stephen reflected on the tasting by saying, all we were after was recognition that there were some very good wines coming out of California which deserved attention. And with Patricia, they were intending to have a tasting that offered good Californian wines to the French. As simple as that, nothing more, nothing less. As we talked about in the context, Stephen and Patricia had travelled out to California, had sourced some excellent wines. One of the questions that is often asked is, why were some of the bigger producers like Mondavi not featured in the tasting? Stephen would reflect in his book very simply, they weren't looking to compare the wines of France to the biggest Californian producers. They were looking for the boutique family-run producers that were reflective of the new age of Californian wine, and hence that characterised all of the players on the list that made it to the final tasting. Initially as well, there was no intention to have French wines. The intention was to show off and showcase 12 Californian wines, 6 white, 6 red, to show what they could do. There was no particular intention to have it publicised or open to the press. The invitation went out at the turn of the year, at the end of 1975, and there was a series of well-known wine tasters and wine professionals who were coming along to taste Californian wine. When they realised that they had more people than they thought they were going to have initially, it wasn't possible to have it in the Académie du Vin. So although it was hosted by the Académie du Vin, Stephen had to look for another location. The easiest location he could find was a room next to a courtyard in the Intercontinental Hotel, not far from the Académie du Vin. That allowed the tasting to happen in the conditions that it did, but it was still quite restricted. They were able to have it on the 24th of May 1976 from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock, but they weren't allowed it after 6 o'clock because there was going to be a wedding that evening. So it was quite restricted. There were no journalists until they decided, it might be a good idea to invite George Tabor, the man that had done the course at the Académie du Vin, who worked at Time magazine, luckily enough. It also was the case that Bella showed up. She was only able to come to the first half of the tasting because she had to go and pick up Kate and Christian, their children, from school. But she brought a camera. If she hadn't brought a camera, there wouldn't be any pictures of the tasting. And a week before the tasting, Stephen thought, do you know what, it might be a little bit more interesting, rather than just to taste the Californian wines, to compare them to French wines. So he picked 8 fine wines from his shop, the Cave de la Madeleine, asked the tasters if they were happy to do the comparison, and hence the idea was crystallised only a week before it actually happened. And at that point, Stephen decided it would be a blind tasting, so there would be no sense of appreciation or understanding which of the wines were Californian or French, although of course everybody assumed that it would be automatically apparent. So the day dawned and the tasting happened on the 24th of May 1976 with all of these elements that had contributed to it. Another one that actually showed how important luck and good fortune was to the whole enterprise was the actual travelling of the wines from California to Paris. I'm delighted to say, as an endorser of and a promoter of wine travel, that actually it was on the back of a wine tour to Champagne and to other regions in France that the group that were coming on the wine tour were asked to bring the wines with them, with TWA on their flight over from California to Paris. And hence, that's how the wines were actually transported to Paris for the tasting. All of these things created the environment and the atmosphere for the tasting to happen at 3 o'clock until 6 o'clock on the 24th of May 1976. I'm not going to go into the details of what happened. You can read about that and you can learn about that in other places. But suffice to say that the most important thing that happened was for both the white wine with Chateau Montelena and the red wine with Stag's Leap, both 1973 vintages, the Californians triumphed over the French, which was an enormous shock and profoundly disconcerting to everybody there. particularly all of the French tasters. So when the results were read out and it turned out that the French had been beaten by the Californians, it was a dramatic moment, but nobody quite appreciated at the time how dramatic its consequences would be. It was, after all, a casual affair that Stephen had done, as he said before, for a bit of fun, to try something out, to celebrate the bicentennial. But, as it so happened, as you may remember, George Tabor was there. And so, on the 7th of June 1976, Time magazine wrote up the tasting, The Judgement of Paris. And everything changed after that. So if it hadn't been for all of the coincidences and the context and the right place and the right time, it would never have happened. But it did. And it was a thunderbolt to the existing and the classic world of wine that existed in 1976. All brought about by those series of events, context and elements of fortune that created the event being able to happen in the way it did, on the day it did, and to create the scenario where the Californians triumphed over the French. A dramatic day in the history of wine. So what did the Judgement of Paris wine tasting mean? First of all, 7th of June 1976, George Tabor published on page 58 an account of the tasting, and the ripples started to roll across the world about what had happened and how important it was. Initially everybody thought, gosh, that's wonderful, the Californians have won. But that was perhaps the least important part of what actually happened. It created a template where you could test the quality of wines from a lesser known location to the classics and have a chance to see what was really the best quality wine at a given time, objectively. It also opened up a dialogue and an interest between Bordeaux and California. It's no coincidence that in 1979, Opus 1, a collaboration between Robert Mondavi and Mouton Rothschild, made its first vintage, a collaboration between the two areas. There were follow-up tastings in each decade that passed. In 1986 and 1996, they refuted the theory that in fact California had only won because their wine showed better when they were younger, because when they were a little bit older, they still won. However, when we got to the tasting in 2006, tasting the 2000 vintages of the wines that had been compared in 1976, the Bordelais won. The lesson from that, if you rest on your laurels, you'll be caught up by your competition. Bordeaux suffered from that problem in 1976, but by the late 1990s and the year 2000, the Californians were suffering the similar problem in reverse. They believed their own publicity a little bit too much. So perhaps one of the wider lessons of the Judgement of Paris wine tasting is to be humble, to be always learning, to be always looking to influences beyond your own shores. That template that Stephen created allowed that to happen, but it's as much a state of mind and an attitude as it is a particular wine or a particular place. You also think that what Stephen created in the Academie du Vin and in the Cave de la Madeleine, in that magical place of the Cité Berrier, allowed the magic to happen. It became historic. In 2016, Stephen and Bella went to the House of Representatives, were awarded an American flag and a document testifying that the tasting had happened on a significant day in US history. Bottles of the two winners were placed in the Smithsonian Museum to recognize how important they were to US history. So overall, it was historic. In the immediate aftermath, it created a wonderful opportunity for the Californians, but for the rest of the New World besides. The Chileans followed up with the Berlin tasting in 2004, and many others besides. So overall, a good day for Californian wine, but in my view, a wonderful day for the world of wine. If you'd like to learn more about the Académie du Vin and the Judgement of Paris, you could read Steven Spurrier's autobiography and George Tabor's book, The Judgement of Paris, which describe the setting up of the Académie du Vin and the events leading up to the Judgement of Paris tasting in more detail. You'd also find it worthwhile to check out Stephen's new Académie du Vin wine library, a publishing house for wine books of authentic storytelling interest about elements of the wine world that are less discovered perhaps. You could also consider running your own Judgement of Paris tasting at home, comparing, like us, a wine from Napa with a wine from Bordeaux, like the Hoops Cabernet we have here from 2013, against the Pessac Léognan Pape Clément from 2013. You could do it as a blind tasting, or you could just have a nice meal and with some friends discuss the wines and decide which one you like best and why. Lastly, if you wanted to take a bit more time to do this and talk about the happy events of wine history and in the great wine regions of the world, why not come on a wine tour with us, Iberian Wine Tours, and spend the time whiling away the evenings with a good glass in your hand, reflecting on the events that made wine history.